After images of migrants dying in trains at railway stations and of really just walking thousands of kilometers to reach home have haunted the nation, the Supreme Court on Thursday said that migrants shouldn't have to pay for train tickets in Shramik trains when they go back home, and they should be given food on the way. Now, there were a lot of arguments that were thrown out by both sides in court. The centre has had its own contention, and now that the Supreme Court has said this, what does the Modi government need to do? This is what we are going to try and figure out in this live episode of Government Matters. Bhadra, who's making her debut in Government Matters, is with me today. She tracks judiciary and legal affairs for ThePrint. Do send in your questions. She'll answer them in the course of this conversation. So, Bhadra, let's first go back to the observations that the court made. It was a suo motu observation, right?
That's right. So, Ruhi, the suo motu cognizance by Supreme Court bench of 3 judges led by Justice Ashok Bhushan was made on Monday, which is 26th of May.
Right.
And of course, there are a lot of mystery which surrounds this order, because earlier in the past twice the court actually refused to intervene in the matter and had expressed satisfaction over the measures the government had taken. So on Monday, when the court was over, an order was released by the Supreme Court on the website, wherein it was stated that the court is taking suo motu cognizance of the migrant crisis, the hardships faced by them in their endeavor to go back home, and they also took note of the fact that several letters and representations were sent to them, prompting them to take this cognizance.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So, what was the centre's contention? I mean, there were a lot of things that were said that people are vultures, to point this out. They're predicting doomsday, etc. Strong words were used.
Yes. So yesterday's hearing in the court was actually quite interesting, because there was a battery of lawyers representing various NGOs and in some cases migrants as well, migrant laborers as well. And the government was represented by Solicitor General Tushar Mehta.
Right.
So he was holding the fort all by himself, and so he got the court actually gave him considerable amount of time to represent the government's case, and the hearing went on for 2 hours. And so basically the government was not interested that the court intervenes in the matter. He had raised very strong objections to court taking a suo motu cognizance. In fact, he reminded the court about the last 2 orders where it refused to intervene, and he was also objectionable. He also showed objection to the fact that several intervention applications had been filed.
Right.
And in the course of the arguments, he actually raised questions over the nature of the intervention applications that were filed, and he actually described the applicants as prophets of doom, who he said were actually keen to spread negativity. Yeah,
he said it thrice.
He said it thrice. And he reiterated and asserted that the government has done enough, has taken sufficient measures to alleviate the hardships faced by the migrant workers, and there was no reason or cause for the court to intervene.
Yes. Right. So, but Bhadra, Supreme Court is not the only court that has spoken up as far as migrants are concerned. There are other high courts which have also talked about it. So, can we just recap that a little bit?
Yeah. So, in fact, there are some dates which are very crucial for it, Ruhi. I would just like to confirm the dates before I tell you. Yeah. So, see, for the first time, the Supreme Court was actually approached by a court on March 31st by an advocate of the Supreme Court. He basically tried to draw the court's attention to the hardships faced by the migrants, but at that point of time, as I have pointed out earlier, the court said it was satisfied with the government's government measures taken, and that was because the government had given a statement to the court that no migrants were walking or no migrants were wanting to go back to their homes, and all of them had been provided shelter and food in respective states. And later, somewhere around mid of May, that is May 15th, the same lawyer approached the court again, and this time he did it, I think, a day or two later after the incident was reported in Maharashtra, where over 16 laborers while sleeping on railway tracks,
they were run over by train.
They were run over by train. So he once again implored the court to intervene. And Again, the court refused to do that. In fact, I think they passed a very insensitive comment on that day by saying that we cannot stop people if they want to walk, or we cannot stop people who want to sleep on railway track. And again, on the same day, the government emphasized that it had taken enough measures and court's intervention was not required. But ironically, on the same day, multiple high courts, various high courts across the country took cognizance of the matter on their own. And Gujarat High Court, for instance, Delhi High Court, for instance, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and all these high courts actually elaborated at length the hardships faced by the migrants. And they, of course, then it became a state-specific issue. With high courts taking the matter in their own hands, it became state-specific issues, and specific directions were issued to the state governments on, to provide shelter, to provide food, to ensure that registration of migrants is done, to ensure that as soon as the registration is done, measures are taken by the states to provide them transport facilities so that they can go back home. So yes, where the Supreme Court failed, the High Courts arose to that moment.
And Gujarat High Court, in fact, has been extremely vocal as far as the COVID situation is concerned in pulling up the state government.
Yes. In fact, High Courts have gone, I think, a step ahead. Besides speaking on the migrants issue, they are actually taking note and stock of the arrangements done by state governments in hospitals, or the arrangements done by state governments with regard to the testing facilities. So I think the high courts have taken, they have considered the entire issue in totality. A very holistic view has been taken by different high courts.
So Bhadra, I have a slew of questions that have already come in. So we'll talk about the onus on the government a little after I take some of the questions. Perhaps some of our viewers have already asked that. There is a question from Jeevant Kumar. Is the government strong enough to support labor administratively and financially? So, there is of course this question of the kind of logistics that would be needed and whether the center is equipped to do it, as he mentions, as this viewer mentions, both administratively and financially, or is there onus on the states as well?
See, I think, it has to be a collaborative effort between the center and the state because the problem is, I think the biggest problem in the entire crisis which actually has unfolded is that none of the state governments have a consolidated data on migrants. And as a result, even the center doesn't have the data. So I think when the lockdown was imposed, probably nobody could foresee this crisis, this approaching crisis. So, and when they decided to lift the lockdown and when the humanitarian crisis unfolded, it progressed, that's when I think they have been taken off guard. So, of course, the center is responsible because after all, the center is the one who is announcing the lockdown, the guidelines, and the state is basically implementing it out. But yes, it has to be a collaborative effort because the state at best, what it can do is it can actually, create a data. Now it can create a data, it can identify the migrants, but to transport them can only be done through the railways, which runs under the central government. Now, as far as the finances are concerned, there has been a lot of controversy over this issue because when the central government decided to start the Shramik trains, the special trains to transport migrants back to their native towns, at that point of time, the issue that arose was with regard to the fares.
Who will pay the fares?
Who will pay the fares? So initially, the notification by the central government said that the states, the two states, the home state where the migrant is supposed to go and the host state where he is staying, both of them have to share the burden. But when some opposition parties pointed this out, then the central government probably rectified its mistakes and said
they came up with a convoluted 85-15.
It was very convoluted. It continued to actually lead to a lot of confusion amongst the migrants. Till date, the migrants really do not know who's paying for it.
But yesterday, the center did specify that.
Yes. So now, during yesterday's hearing, it was clarified that it is the states who are actually taking the burden, and it has to be shared between the two states. So the center in a way has admitted that it is not contributing to the
fares of Shramik Express.
That's right.
There's a question from Ravindra Kulkarni. Is this not a case of justice delayed being justice denied? Last hearing, the court accepted the government version and said of nobody walking on the road. The court should have woken up then. So surely, Bhadra, there is something to be said about when the Supreme Court has responded. This is after there's been much outrage, when disturbing images have appeared, have emerged.
That's right. I think, the court could have intervened way back. At least, I'm not talking about the March time, but yes, when the petition was filed for the second time on May 15th, I think that was the time when the court should have actually taken note of the entire issue. And I think it has been a gross failure on the part of the court, which is actually seen as an institution, as a constitutional authority in the country that is required to protect the fundamental rights. We really need to remember one thing, that in this entire scenario, due to the lockdown, something called liberty to move has been curtailed. It has been suspended for some time. So in those circumstances, under those circumstances, the Supreme Court should have stepped in. It is definitely a failure on the part of the court, because I think if at that point of time it would have been then some responsibility,
somebody to question the government at least.
Somebody would have been there to question the central government or the states. See, as far as the states are concerned, the high courts have taken note of it and state governments are responding. But as far as the central government's role is concerned, nobody has scrutinized that earlier. So now with yesterday's order, now it actually comes under scrutiny. Because now the central government will be forced to kind of seek status reports from the state governments. It may be just because they have to inform the court, but at least they will get into some action, some process will begin. That's
There's a question from Fateh Singh. This is on Twitter. Is the government confused? Why is there so much mismanagement? Is it because of the tensions between the states or between the center and states? So, what is it that, was there a lot of blaming of states that happened in court yesterday as far as Tushar Mehta was concerned?
No. So, as far as yesterday's hearing is concerned, there was no blame game. I must admit that, because Tushar Mehta was very categorical in his statement when he said that, the states and center have done sufficiently. So, inside the court there was no blame game happening, but yes, I think outside the court a lot has happened. And as I said earlier, probably the reason has been because the magnanimity of the situation, nobody could actually anticipate it. Nobody could probably
it is an unprecedented situation.
It is an unprecedented situation, and I think everywhere I think all the authorities are to be blamed for it, not just the center but even for the state governments. In fact, when the court takes up the matter again on June 3rd, and that's the time when the state governments will also file their response on what measures have they taken. So I guess the picture will be clearer then as to what kind of support have they got from the center in handling the entire crisis.
Sankal, why are states not enthusiastic about the return of migrants? Is it just the fear of spread of the virus or the inability of states to provide alternate employment? I think I'll take this one, Bhadra. So, essentially what's happening is that no state wants a situation where they seem like they're not in control or the COVID numbers are out of hand, which is what is happening once migrants are going back. And I think that has been the reason for resistance. Also, how do you provide livelihood to those people who are going back? Again, no state wants an increase in the number of jobless people in their territory. This has been particularly problematic for poll-bound states like Bihar or West Bengal. Bihar, which goes to polls this year, West Bengal next year. There has been a lot of resistance to take migrants back, because at the end of the day, your COVID figures would shoot up. You're under pressure to show that you're performing, and you also don't want unemployed people with no food to eat before elections, because that takes away a lot of your votes.
I just want to add into this point. Yesterday during the hearing, in fact, Tushar Mehta, when the order was being dictated, so he had certain reservations, and what he actually said was that, my lord, this order will actually encourage more migrants to leave. So I think somewhere down the line even the center is worried, because I think probably they can probably see that it might lead to certain imbalance in states, where because the center after all is looking forward to start some economic activity.
Also to bring them back to work will be another nightmare.
Yes,
so that in itself is a problem. There's a question from Tarush. Can the government ignore the court's order and take time in implementing it? Actually, so this opens the door to talking about what next. What does the government have to do now in terms of actual concrete steps?
See, now if you go by the directions given by the court, the directions are very specifically to the states.
Right.
As far as the center is concerned, I think it will actually become a supervising authority, because the center, after all, now will be answerable to the court. Now, if you analyze the directions, so like the first direction says that the migrants will not be charged.
Right.
So again, the states have to ensure that they do not charge the migrants. The second direction says that when the migrant is about to board the train, then the state from where the train originates, that particular state has to provide food and water.
Right.
During the journey, of course, the railway ministry, which is under the central government, has to make the arrangement. And once they reach the home state, then that particular state, the receiving state, has to ensure that they reach their houses, their native towns. And before they are transported to the native towns, whatever facilities they would be providing to the migrants with regard to testing, shelter, quarantine, all that has to be borne by the state government.
Right.
So it is in the sense that now it is of course difficult. It will be difficult for them for not to implement it. So they have to follow it. After all, they will be submitting status reports before the court, and
it is the court at the end of the day.
It is the court of the end of the day. Yeah.
Right. There's a question from Sid. Can states like West Bengal and Bihar be sued for their outright denial of entry to the migrants? There was a similar question that we had in another episode of Government Matters, whether constitutionally or legally these states can just say no, that we don't want to take migrants back.
This legal question hasn't arisen as of now. But I think why states are actually, taking this call is because the central government has left it to them to decide. The central government has simply laid out a broad framework, and the states need to kind of finally get down to the nitty-gritties. So it is up to the states to lay down the guidelines. So as you said, that in order to protect themselves, the states are taking these measures. In fact, this question of law has actually risen before the Supreme Court, where the central government has been asked to specify its stand.
Right.
So till now, the central government has kept quiet. They haven't
said anything.
They haven't said anything. But now, since the Supreme Court has asked for a response, they would be forced to give a stand.
Right.
So let's see how center reacts to the situation. And then we'll see how the how the Supreme Court actually takes a call on this.
Right. There's a question from Abhijit. How much money is needed to solve the crisis? Who's doing the planning, budget and execution? Now, this is a question that I think neither I are quite equipped to answer, but I'll make sure that Ramya Nair, who tracks the economy for us, who tracks the finance ministry for us, does respond to your question through a comment on YouTube. So Bhadra, before we close, now that the Supreme Court has made a beginning, has, as you said, put some kind of scrutiny on the center, do you think the court becoming more proactive on this front now?
I can only say that I wish the court becomes more proactive in this front, because as a Supreme Court reporter, what I have really noticed is that when these matters are taken up for hearing, the courts are very enthusiastic initially,
right? But
with time, that enthusiasm dies. And often such matters are then pushed to a cold storage.
Right.
So I can sincerely wish that at least in this case, the Supreme Court actually stands up and proves itself in this hour of crisis, because I think it's an institution to which everybody looks upon to.
Right, and that's the last resort for it.
Exactly. So I think they should not fail the citizens of the country in this hour of crisis.
Right. Well, on that note, thank you so much for watching Government Matters, for sending in your questions. On Monday, we have a very special edition of Off the Cuff in the evening, which you can catch live on our YouTube channel, which will see our Editor-in-Chief Shekhar Gupta in conversation with Israel's Ambassador to India, Ron Malka. So do stay tuned for that. We'll keep bringing you updates on that as well. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.